St. John of the Cross teaches that even during some of these wonderful experiences of exuberant mysticism, there are what he calls alarms. There's a certain sense that there are a few uncooked seeds in the unconscious that haven't been corrected by the night of sense. A certain distractedness of mind, a certain residue of cultural conditioning, and of the false self-system in general. So at some point, the night of spirit begins, and all of these experiences seem to subside and go away, leaving the persons who have been led by that path in a state of intense longing, because in exact proportion to the spiritual consolation they've experienced, when this is taken away, the existential pain of being a separate identity is reaching out for union with Christ and the interior presence of God. So this is painful because of that situation. Perhaps it's less painful for those who are led by the back stairs, since they never had much of that taste of God's presence. In any case, it's extremely important to realize that the night of spirit is essential for the final movement into divine union. Without that experience, the false self has not completely died, and we may fall subject to what might be called the spiritual archetypes in the unconscious. That is to say, because, and those who have been in this exuberant mysticism are especially susceptible. Suppose, for instance, they are experiencing charismatic gifts, psychic gifts of one kind or another, or are very gifted in teaching or as a charismatic leader. The very gifts that they have received, which attract other people toward them or toward their teaching, becomes a temptation to identify with a role. So the archetypes in the spiritual unconscious are the most dangerous, much more dangerous than the ones we were discussing in the last conference, where they are simply the glorification of the emotional programs for happiness. In other words, the temptation arises because of one's spiritual attainment to identify with the role of prophet, enlightened teacher, illumined professor, a martyr, a victim, a charismatic leader, God's gift to humanity. In other words, the night of spirit is that deep purification that reduces those temptations to zero, because in the night of spirit one experiences oneself as capable of every evil. Not that you're inclined to do it so much, but one feels completely dependent on God in order to avoid personal sin or the inconveniences of the habitual hang-ups of our past. The true prophet, martyr, or one who is sent by God does not dominate, but serves. Service is the hallmark of someone who is sent. Notice how Jesus in the gospel emphasizes again and again that he was sent, that he did nothing of himself, and over again that's his argument about every accusation about what he's doing. I'm doing what I see the Father doing. I have come because I was sent. And then he sends the disciples or apostles. And this is what distinguishes true ministry or true apostleship when it involves the special gifts from partial enlightenment. In a partial enlightenment, the temptation to identify with a role is the characteristic trap. In a ministry that is sent by God and inspired by God, one is sent and receives the ministry, and that means that one has to exercise it on God's terms. That's the whole difference. You don't dominate it, you receive it, and you share it humbly with insofar as one is sent. And what characterizes the sending of true apostleship is precisely opposition, persecution, disappointment, failure, and possibly death, if you're lucky. So this is the example that Jesus has given us. He did not invoke his psychic powers, his supernatural gifts, or his prerogatives as the Son of God to defend either his ministry or himself, but allowed himself to experience the utmost of suffering, defeat, rejection, as part of being sent, as part of manifesting the mysterious inner nature of the ultimate reality that is really beyond any concept of a human being. But his passion and death, as well as his resurrection, puts an enormous question mark in front of everything we look upon as happiness or success or meaning. This is the temptation that is purified in the night of spirit by the sense of powerlessness, by the sense of being capable of all evil, and the sense of sometimes, when it's very acute, of being abandoned by God, even to the point of having what might be called an impersonal experience of God. In other words, God doesn't seem to care anymore. He's not around. He's not a person as far as our relationship used to be. Or if he's a person, he's someone we never knew before. In other words, now God is purifying our ideas of him from all of life up to this point, including some of our ideas that we've developed as a result of the close union experienced in certain gifts of his presence during the period of exuberant mysticism, if that was our gift. So that you might say there are 5 great fruits of the night of the Spirit. The first one is this freedom from the danger of succumbing to the attraction of assuming a role because of one's special gifts or charisms that one has been freely given by God. It also purifies even that secret satisfaction in being the chosen one or the recipient of some special gifts of God. In other words, it prepares one just to belong to the human race as the greatest vocation there is, at least as the basis, and to allow God to treat us like anybody else, and to find him in that treatment rather than in any special experience that might have that singles us out or separates us from humanity. In other words, it's not by climbing up into becoming some celebrity that one fulfills the gospel, but by the intuition that God is coming down to the lowest possible level in order to grasp humanity even in its alienation from him and to gradually pull it back. That's really the meaning of the crucifixion at the deepest level. Christ represents us, the greatest of sinners, on the cross, and identifies with those consequences, which is alienation, rejection, failure, the feeling of abandonment by God. And it is in that sacrifice of his divine prerogatives that he becomes the Savior and the glorified one, and enters into the ascension and the fullness of his glory, not by some earthly success, or by taking to himself a role that was not given to him. The second one, and perhaps one that is more frequent, since most of us don't experience extraordinary gifts, that would make us heir to that temptation of the collective archetypes in the unconscious, especially the more heroic ones. And that is the freedom from the domination of any emotion. That's what characterizes the false self system, being pushed around by our feelings, either trying to get something we want or to get away from some painful emotion. And thus, the great gift of the night of the Spirit is this gradual freeing us from the last traces of domination by emotional swings and moods. It's not a repression, still less a suppression by force of emotions that we don't want. It's rather the acceptance of them and the integration of them into the spiritual part of our nature, where they begin to serve the decisions of reason and will and back them up. And that integration of our emotional life with reason and faith and its subjection to God's will is what St. Thomas Aquinas regards as human happiness. That is, it's doing what is right and good and enjoying doing it. That's the way human beings were meant to be. And this is being restored gradually in the night of Spirit by reducing the last traces of our subjection to emotional patterns, moods, or the residue of the emotional programs for happiness on the spiritual level of our being. We already had laid them to rest in the emotional or sense level. A third one is the purification of our idea of God. In other words, we may have thought of God as the God of our childhood, or the God of our group, or and absorbed unquestioningly some of those attitudes towards him. Now God presents himself as infinite, incomprehensible, and ineffable. We can't even describe the experience of pure faith. We can't tell somebody what we're experiencing. We only know that this immense energy is opening up inside of us that has no name. And it's not exactly personal or impersonal, although it certainly treats us in a personal way. And we feel this longing to identify with it and to be free, to be at one, and to let go of the selfishness that sort of lingers in our emotional programs for happiness, even as we experience the wonderful gifts, if we experience them, of the prayer of union or full union. The purification of our idea of God means that faith and hope are purified of the human props. In other words, we might experience at this point some rejection from the group from whom we had drawn our spiritual or religious identity. There may be a breakup with our spiritual director. There may be some other breakdown in our relationships with people on whom we too greatly depended for the meaning of our life or for our spiritual development. And sometimes this can be acute. In other words, sometimes our idea of the spiritual life is shattered by some event. Or our idea of the church, our idea of Jesus Christ, or even of God himself is turned upside down. And you see these experiences reflected in the great personages of Scripture. Not just to mention Jesus, whose whole life was built on his personal union with the Father. And that was his message. And yet, in his last moments, we see him experiencing that relationship as a gigantic question mark. Why are you abandoning me? And in that quotation, he speaks of my God, when all the other times he spoke of Abba, the personal Father. And so Jesus, in his last hours, was faced with the ultimate shattering experience of the relationship on which he had built his life and ministry. Or again, take Job. Here's Job, was the model of perfection and was admired by everybody, and all of a sudden everything, his property, his family, his reputation, and even his bodily health were all taken away in a few days. What kind of a God is this who does that to you? Well, he complains for any number of chapters about such treatment. But the point is, he would never have learned who God was, who describes himself in the last chapter through any number of enigmas, unless he had gone through that shattering experience which had brought to an end his conception of how God functions or treats his friends. So this business of accepting God on his own terms, just as he is what is the work of the night of spirit and the purification of pure faith. Now we believe in God because of how he reveals himself to us without asking him to reveal himself in any special way. In other words, it's to allow God to be himself just as he is without knowing who or what that is. Hence, it's a total act of self-surrender and abandonment that is being developed and made available to us in the night of spirit, where the divine light is so pure and so that it is imperceptible to any of our faculties. Hence, it's experienced as a ray of darkness, according to John of the Cross. And since there is no personal experience or any props that we used to rely on have all been gradually taken away, this is a moment of existential doubt in the extreme for some people. Because now it's God, let him be whatever he is, and you're willing to accept him on that basis. Hence, the trust also grows. Trust not based on one's good deeds in the past or one's role or one's mission or anything about the self, but simply trust in the infinite mercy of God because he is infinite, and mercy reaches out to weakness and to need of its very nature. And so one begins to be content with this possession in pure faith of a God who is infinitely merciful and infinitely trustworthy. The divine love is infused in that seedbed of submission, self-surrender, abandonment, and patience. And this is the factor that is transforming and which gradually brings God's servants through the dark night, maintains their commitment, and eventually the same fire, as John of the Cross calls it, that is sometimes experienced painfully in the night of spirit, begins to become soft and gentle and loving and glorifying. And this is the sign that one is emerging through the night and the dawn is not far off. A dawn in which the false self has finally died and the big I of our ego diminishes to a very small I with its selfishness and concerns, and the great I am of Scripture, that is to say, the capital I, becomes the divine life within us, the risen life of Christ, and the motivation of the Spirit suggesting what to do in every moment under the inspiration of divine love, self-giving love, rather than under the motivation of self-interest or selfishness, even in its very moderate form. Thus, the divine plan seems to be to transform human nature into the divine, not by creating it with some special role or giving it some kind of tremendous powers, but rather in enabling it to live ordinary life with extraordinary motivation. And the motivation is showing love, compassion, forgiveness, kindness, concern, even at great sacrifice of one's own interest, bodily, mentally, or even spiritually. What characterizes the transforming union is interesting, because now the emotions with their domination has subsided. The emotional swings disappear, and one is aware that what one thought was one's emotions really were not them, but one's interpretation of them through the eyes or the feelings of the false self system. Now the emotions are just as strong as ever, more so, but they have no drag and they don't stimulate one towards any kind of selfish activity. Hence one is still aware that one could sin, but there's no reason to, no interest, no drag, no stimulation away from these movements of divine love. And hence the freedom from the false self-system and emotional domination is complete. The fathers of the desert had a word for this experience. They called it apatheia, which is sometimes mistranslated as indifference. It's not at all indifference. It's a tremendous concern for everything that is without an emotional involvement from the false self-system. Hence one is free to devote oneself and to be present to everyone and their needs without getting unduly evolved in emotional melodrama or involvement with them, so that one remains free to reflect back to them the truth and to be present to them without filtering their problems through the smoked glasses of our own. Hence, in the transforming union, one is present to people at the deepest level and perceives the presence of God, Christ in them, and the energy to serve them is now free, and one longs to be able to share with them something of this freedom without any anxiety or without trying to change them or force them. One simply has the divine life to offer to anybody who wants it, and one humbly offers this in submission to the risen life of Christ and the gifts of the Spirit, which suggest what is to be done or not done in incredible detail all day long as the transforming union develops into a permanent state. Now that union, as we said, is not an experience, but a restructuring of consciousness, which enables a new dimension of reality to become spontaneously present to the other three-dimensional world that we're normally accustomed to. So it's a way of being in the world, a way of transcending everything in the world without leaving it. And the freedom is the non-possessive attitude, because there is no I anymore that's interested to possess anything. Now, that doesn't mean that one doesn't use the good things of life, but they become stepping stones now to the love of God and to God's presence, which now begins to filter from the still point or from our inmost being through the other faculties, purifying our senses so that now we are sensitive to God's presence through every experience, including the experience of the senses, the experience of our own reasoning, imagination, and will. Thus, everything becomes transparent. We often think of God as the pen creator, dominating everybody. Well, I guess he is in charge of everything. At the same time, notice how he exercises that authority and dominion. It is by serving everybody all day long, otherwise we wouldn't be here. He's created this planet with exquisite care. It couldn't have existed with a few changes Fahrenheit at the time of the Big Bang. He takes care of us with air, food, and people all day long. Service is who ultimate reality is. But service without looking for any return, just because that's the way it is. That's what he is. And those in transforming union are beginning to find that out. Hence, they too will become servants, not dominators. It's this then that is the first part of the Christian journey. Beyond that, which is the normal Christian life, the transforming union continues to transform into ourselves all the human relationships with God, ourselves, and other people.